You think cowboys walked into saloons just for whiskey? Think again. These Wild West watering holes served up some of the strangest, richest, and most surprising meals on the frontier. From deep-fried bull testicles to sourdough pancakes carried in saddlebags, these aren't campfire myths. They're real dishes served to real gunslingers across the American West. Let's dig into 25 cowboy recipes you never knew were actually on the menu at Wild West saloons. 1. Son of a gun stew, the Cowboys Mystery Bowl. You think cowboys measured toughness by their trigger finger? Nope. Real grit was proven at the saloon table with a steaming bowl of son of a gun stew. This wasn't a dish. It was a dare in liquid form. Imagine a pot filled with tripe, heart, liver, kidneys, marrow, and yes, sometimes even brain. Toss in potatoes, onions, maybe a wild herb or two, and you had the Wild West version of don't ask, just eat. For ranchers and saloon owners, nothing went to waste. If it could be boiled, it went into the pot. And here's the kicker. Finishing the stew meant respect. It was less about flavor and more about proving you were tough enough to survive the frontier. No Yelp reviews, no substitutions, just guts, literally. But if Oregon stew makes your stomach churn, don't worry. The next dish was pure cowboy comfort, fried golden on cast iron, flapjacks. 2. Sourdough flapjacks, pancakes that punch back. Forget fluffy pancakes with strawberries. Cowboys had sourdough flapjacks, chewy, tangy, and heavy enough to sink a ship. The magic came from a sourdough starter carried in tins tied to saddlebags. That starter was older than some saloon owners, bubbling away for weeks as riders crossed the plains. The recipe was simple: flour, water, salt, fried in bacon grease until the edges crisped. No sugar, no frills. If you were lucky, you got molasses or canned fruit on top. If you weren't, you got grease. Either way, flapjacks earned the nickname sinkers because they hit your gut like a rock. And that was the point. A cowboy couldn't gamble or ride all day on an empty stomach. Now, flapjacks filled you up, but the king of saloon tables was still waiting. A dish so iconic it became the poster child of cowboy cooking: pork and beans. 3. Fried salt pork and beans, the real cowboy classic. Step aside, steak and potatoes. The true champion of frontier dining was fried salt pork and beans. Salt pork was fatty meat packed in barrels of brine, tough enough to survive a desert summer. Slice it, fry it in its own grease until crispy, and toss it over beans that had been simmering for hours. Pinto beans, navy beans, didn't matter. The longer they cooked, the better they tasted. Saloons served beans around the clock, ladled out by the bowlful. Sometimes cooks spiced things up with onions or molasses, but most of the time it was just beans, pork, and fire. It wasn't fine dining, it was survival food that stuck with you long enough to face a dusty trail, a long poker game, or maybe a bar fight. And what better way to chase a belly full of beans than with the Wild West version of rocket fuel? Let's talk cowboy coffee. 4. Chuck wagon coffee, liquid lightning in a tin cup. If espresso is your morning kick, then cowboy coffee was a full-blown mule kick to the chest. Known as six-shooter brew, this stuff was boiled in blackened tin pots over campfires and saloon stoves. No fancy filters. Just toss the grounds into boiling water, stir with a stick, and pray your teeth could handle the grit. To settle the sludge, cooks dropped in eggshells or even strips of rawhide. The result? A drink so strong it could float a horseshoe. Saloons kept pots of it simmering all day, ready to serve in dented tin mugs for a coin or two. And if you needed flavor, the bartender would pour in a splash of whiskey. Congratulations, you just invented the original Irish coffee. But coffee wasn't the real test of cowboy courage. That honor belonged to a dish with a name that fooled city slickers: prairie oysters. 5. Prairie oysters, the saloon's toughest bite. Here's where the Wild West separated the brave from the squeamish. Prairie oysters weren't seafood. They were deep-fried bull testicles. Yep. After cattle castrations, nothing went to waste. Saloons sliced, battered, and fried the leftovers until golden brown. Served hot with mustard, vinegar, or hot sauce. Prairie oysters weren't about taste. They were about toughness. Eat them, and you proved you were a real cowboy. Refuse, and you'd never live it down. These weren't just bar snacks. They were rites of passage. Branding festivals in Colorado, Wyoming, and Texas turned them into full-on community events. Picture a saloon full of men daring each other, mugs of whiskey in hand, laughing between bites of fried bull parts. And if you thought bull testicles were wild, just wait. Our next saloon favorite was a rabbit stew that kept the frontier running when beef ran short. 6. Rabbit stew, frontier comfort food. When beef was scarce and a cowboy's pockets were lighter than his saddle, saloons turned to the next best thing, rabbit stew. Rabbits were everywhere, lean, easy to hunt, and cheap. The frontier's version of budget protein. Cooks browned the meat and pork fat, tossed it into a pot with potatoes, carrots, onions, maybe a wild turnip if one rolled in, and let it simmer for hours until the meat fell off the bone. Some saloons, especially in New Mexico, kicked things up with chilies, cumin, and garlic, blending cowboy grub with Mexican flavors. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, filling, and familiar. After weeks of jerky and beans, rabbit stew felt like coming home, even if that home was a smoky saloon with bat-wing doors creaking in the wind. But rabbits weren't the only woodland critters on the menu. If you thought stew was rustic, wait until you hear about squirrel fricassee. 7. Squirrel fricassee, a dish for the brave and the broke. Yes, you heard that right, squirrel fricassee. In towns tucked near forests, when beef prices shot up, squirrels stepped up. Cheap, abundant, and surprisingly tasty, they became a go-to protein in saloons across Missouri and Arkansas. The method was straight from Europe. Fry the squirrel pieces lightly, then simmer them in a creamy gravy made with milk, flour, and pan drippings. Add a sprinkle of pepper, pour it over biscuits or cornbread, and you had a hearty, rib-sticking meal. But here's the thing. This wasn't a dish you bragged about in the big city. It was local, low profile, and whispered about in saloon backrooms. To the locals, it was comfort food. To outsiders, it was a dare. Speaking of comfort food, the next saloon staple wasn't wild game at all. It was cornbread's grittier cousin, the legendary Corn Dodger. 8. Corn Dodger biscuits, the frontier's grab-and-go bread-forget-fancy yeast rolls. On the frontier, saloons served Corn Dodgers, dense oval biscuits made from cornmeal, boiling water, and a pinch of salt. Sometimes cooks added pork fat for flavor, but mostly these were plain, practical, and tough enough to survive days in a saddlebag. They were fried, baked, or cooked on hot rocks, then stacked high in saloon kitchens. Hungry cowboys grabbed them by the handful, dunking them in beans, stew, or molasses. The texture, gritty. The flavor, smoky and simple. The effect, instant fuel for another long ride. Corn Dodgers were the West's version of grab-and-go. They didn't crumble, they didn't spoil, and they sure didn't disappoint when paired with a pint of beer. But if you wanted something quicker than bread, saloons had just the thing waiting on the counter: eggs. Not fresh, sunny-side-up eggs, but pickled ones floating in cloudy jars. 9. Pickled eggs, protein in a jar. Every saloon counter had one, a big glass jar full of cloudy liquid and pale eggs. That wasn't decoration, it was dinner. Pickled eggs were the original bar snack. Boiled eggs were dunked in a brine of vinegar, salt, peppercorns, garlic, mustard seed, and sometimes beet juice or chili peppers for extra color and kick. After soaking for days or weeks, they turned into sour, tangy, protein-packed bombs. For a few cents, you could pluck one out, crack it on the bar, peel, and swallow. No utensils, no ceremony. Just down the hatch with a swig of beer or rye. It was fast food before fast food, and it kept cowboys upright long enough for another round of whiskey. But for something with a little more bite, literally, the next saloon dish took one of the hardest trail rations ever made and softened it with a river of gravy. 10. Hardtack and gravy. Making the inedible edible hardtack was the brick of the frontier. Flour, water, salt, baked until it could break your teeth. Soldiers called it molar breakers, and they weren't kidding. But in saloons, cooks knew a trick. Drown it in gravy. They'd smash hardtack into chunks, soak it in water or broth, and cover it with a bubbling gravy made from pork drippings, flour, onions, and pepper. Suddenly, the indestructible cracker became edible, even comforting. For a cowboy chewing on dust all week, this was civilization on a plate. Simple, hot, salty, and hearty enough to make you forget you were eating survival food. With the right gravy, even the hardest tack became soft nostalgia. But survival food wasn't always cheap or bland. Sometimes saloons splurged, serving up something so prized it nearly wiped out an entire species. Buffalo roast. 11. Buffalo roast, the meat that fed the West. Before cattle ranches ruled the plains, there was one king of the frontier table, buffalo roast. Thick slabs of bison meat, roasted over open flames or slow-cooked in iron pots, were the crown jewel of saloon dining, when you could get them. Buffalo was rich, lean, and wildly abundant, until hunters slaughtered them by the millions. In saloons, it was served rare and rugged, paired with potatoes or cornbread. For travelers, buffalo was more than dinner. It was a taste of the untamed frontier itself. But here's the tragedy. By the late 1800s, buffalo meat in saloons became rare, not because it wasn't delicious, but because there simply weren't many buffalo left. Each roast carried the bittersweet flavor of indulgence and extinction. And when the buffalo were gone, saloons turned to the next most available herd animal, good old beefsteak, fried hard and served fast. 12. Fried beefsteak, the frontier's working man's dinner. Nothing said saloon dinner quite like a sizzling fried beefsteak. This wasn't tender filet mignon. It was tough, stringy cuts pounded flat with a hammer, dredged in flour and fried in hot lard until the edges crisped. Add a splash of coffee or whiskey to the pan, scrape up the drippings, and boom, you had cowboy gravy. Beefsteak was filling, affordable, and fast, making it a saloon staple for hungry ranch hands and miners. Sometimes it came topped with onions, sometimes with potatoes on the side, but most of the time it was just steak, grease, and grit. It might not win awards in Paris, but in the Wild West, this was a 5-star feast. Of course, beefsteak wasn't always enough. If you wanted a one-dish wonder that piled on meat, beans, and spice, you ordered the king of cowboy comfort, chili. 13. Cowboy chili, spice on the range, forget modern chili cook-offs. The original cowboy chili was born in saloons, campfires, and chuck wagons. Dried beef or venison was chopped up, mixed with dried chilies, onions, garlic, and beans, if the cook had them, and simmered for hours. Some versions were fiery enough to strip paint off the bar. Others leaned heavy on cumin and oregano, flavors borrowed from Mexican vaqueros. Either way, chili was hearty, spicy, and perfect for warming up a gunslinger who just spent 12 hours riding through dust storms. Cowboys even nicknamed it son of a gun stew with a kick. Cheap, versatile, and endlessly customizable, chili became one of the most enduring foods of the West, and it's still around today in cook-offs, diners, and backyard grills. But if chili was a meal, what about snacks? Enter the simplest, saltiest, and crunchiest treat on every saloon bar: roasted peanuts. 14. Roasted peanuts, the original bar snack. Before pretzels and potato chips, saloons had barrels of roasted peanuts sitting right on the counter. Cheap to buy, easy to roast, and addictive to crack open, peanuts were the ultimate companion to beer or whiskey. Cowboys loved them because they were portable and filling. Saloon owners loved them because the salt made customers drink more. Everyone won, except the poor guy sweeping up peanut shells every night. Sometimes saloons spiced them with chili powder or garlic. Other times they were served plain and warm. Either way, peanuts were the frontier's answer to modern bar mix. And yes, the sound of shells crunching under boots was just part of the saloon soundtrack. But peanuts weren't the only bar snack on offer. Some saloons kept things even leaner: jerky, the beef leather that lasted longer than a poker game. 15. Beef jerky, trail ration. Turned bar food, cowboys practically lived on beef jerky during cattle drives, so it was no surprise saloons had it on hand too. Strips of beef were salted, spiced, and dried until they were tough enough to chew like leather but packed with flavor that exploded the longer you gnawed. Saloons sold it by the strip, sometimes plain, sometimes spiced with pepper or chilies. It wasn't glamorous, but jerky was the ultimate grab-and-go protein, perfect for cowboys who didn't want to sit down for a full meal. Plus, jerky didn't spoil, making it as reliable as the bartender's glare when you couldn't pay your tab. A strip of jerky and a shot of whiskey was basically the frontier's version of fast food, but jerky was just the quick fix. For something truly hearty, saloons served a dish that oozed grease, gravy, and comfort: biscuits and sausage gravy. 16. Biscuits and sausage gravy, frontier comfort food. If there's one dish that could make a cowboy forget his saddle sores, it was biscuits and sausage gravy. Picture warm, flaky biscuits smothered in a thick, peppery gravy made from sausage drippings and flour. It was heavy, greasy, and glorious. Saloons served it early in the morning for miners and cowhands who needed fuel before a brutal day. But it was also the go-to for gamblers rolling out of all-night poker games. It wasn't just food, it was hangover insurance. The beauty of this dish was in its simplicity: biscuits baked in cast iron, gravy whipped up in the same pan where the sausage had just sizzled. The flavor? Smoky, savory, and unforgettable. This was the West's version of comfort food, and saloons knew it kept customers coming back. But biscuits weren't the only doughy delight on the menu. The next treat was fried golden, sweet, and surprisingly addictive: donuts. 17. Frontier donuts. Sweetness in a rough world. You wouldn't expect cowboys to have a sweet tooth, but saloons knew better. Enter the frontier donut: fried dough rings cooked in lard and dusted with sugar or cinnamon if supplies allowed. They weren't delicate bakery treats. These were rugged, uneven, sometimes tough on the outside, but sweet on the inside, much like the men who ate them. Saloons served donuts alongside coffee, making them the closest thing the Wild West had to a morning cafe vibe. They became especially popular during holidays or paydays, when saloons used sweets to lure in crowds. And yes, cowboys could and did dunk them in whiskey when coffee wasn't handy. Donuts proved that even in a world of beans and beef, people still craved a little joy. Speaking of sweet cravings, saloons also stocked something even simpler: slices of pie that could turn any cowboy into a loyal customer. 18. Saloon pie, America's sweetheart of the frontier. If there was one dessert that screamed home, it was pie. Apple, peach, cherry, saloons baked whatever fruit they could get their hands on. In mining towns, dried or canned fruit filled the gaps, while frontier wives supplied fresh pies when harvests allowed. Pie wasn't just dessert, it was marketing. A slice of warm pie and coffee drew in paying customers faster than a whiskey special. In fact, Saloons used pies as loyalty bait. Feed a cowboy something sweet, and he'd stick around for 3 more rounds of beer. Pies were rustic, messy, and sometimes a little burnt, but they carried the rare luxury of sugar, butter, and fruit, all precious on the frontier. To a homesick traveler, one bite was worth every cent. But not every cowboy wanted sugar. Some craved salt, and saloons had just the thing: smoked fish, hauled in from rivers and coasts. 19. Smoked fish, from river to saloon. It may sound strange, but many saloons, especially near railroads and rivers, served smoked fish. Salmon, trout, and herring were salted, smoked, and shipped in barrels across the frontier. Served with bread or crackers, smoked fish was salty, oily, and satisfying, perfect alongside beer. It wasn't everyday fare, but it added variety to saloon menus dominated by beef and beans. For Scandinavian and German immigrants who wandered west, it tasted like home. Some saloons even served pickled fish steeped in vinegar and spices, giving cowboys a tangy kick between whiskey shots. It might not have been glamorous, but smoked fish brought a touch of old-world tradition to the roughest of saloons. And if fish wasn't your style, don't worry. Saloons had another salty staple: cheese served plain, sharp, and often right off the block. 20. Saloon cheese, the frontier's cheesy side. On every saloon counter, next to the jar of pickled eggs, you'd likely spot a chunk of cheese. Cheddar was the most common, arriving in big wheels from eastern dairies, then cut into wedges and served with bread, crackers, or beer. It wasn't melted into nachos or baked into casseroles, just plain, hearty cheese that filled bellies and paired perfectly with alcohol. Saloon keepers loved it because it kept well, satisfied hunger, and encouraged patrons to drink more. For cowboys, cheese was an indulgence. For immigrants from Europe, it was a taste of home. And for saloons, it was business strategy disguised as a snack. But cheese was just the appetizer, the real showstopper. The dish that could stretch $1 and feed a crowd was mutton stew. 21. Mutton stew, stretching the frontier dollar. When cattle was pricey and buffalo scarce, saloons turned to mutton stew. Sheep were cheap, tough, and everywhere, so their meat found its way into iron pots across the West. Mutton stew was hearty, but far from delicate. The meat was gamier than beef, but slow simmering with onions, potatoes, carrots, and herbs softened both the texture and the flavor. Sometimes cooks added barley for thickness, creating a stick-to-your-ribs meal that filled a cowboy for pennies. It wasn't glamorous. In fact, mutton often ranked lower than beef or pork, but it was reliable. For saloon owners, it was profit. For cowboys, it was fuel. And in the frontier, fuel was survival. But if stew felt too humble, the next dish was pure luxury on a plate: oysters shipped on ice straight from the coasts. 22. Fresh oysters. High-class dining in a dusty bar. Believe it or not, cowboys in landlocked towns slurped fresh oysters. Thanks to the new railroads and blocks of ice shipped from the East Coast, oysters arrived in barrels packed in sawdust. Saloons served them raw, fried, or stewed, and they were considered a delicacy, proof that even in a dusty town, you could taste high society. Eating oysters in a frontier saloon was like ordering champagne in a dive bar today. Surprising, showy, and expensive. They became status food, often paired with whiskey or fine wine for customers with deep pockets. To regular cowboys, oysters were a spectacle. To wealthy miners and railroad men, they were dinner. But for those who couldn't afford oysters, saloons had a more down-to-earth treat waiting in jars: pickled pig's feet. 23. Pickled pig's feet, tangy, tough, and totally frontier. Few foods scream saloon snack louder than pickled pig's feet. Preserved in vinegar brine with garlic, peppercorns, and bay leaves, they were equal parts salty, sour, and chewy. Cowboys cracked them open straight from the jar, gnawing on bone and gristle while washing it down with whiskey. They weren't dainty, but they were durable, cheap, and perfect for saloon counters. Some swore by their flavor, others tolerated them only after 3 drinks, but nobody denied they filled the belly. Pickled pig's feet were proof that frontier cooking was about practicality first, pleasure second, and yet they remained a staple for decades, long after the Wild West faded into legend. But let's end on a sweeter note, because saloons weren't all brine and beans. When sugar and fruit rolled into town, pies weren't the only treat. Fruit preserves took center stage. 24. Fruit preserves, sweetness by the spoonful. Amid all the salt, grease, and grit, saloons sometimes surprised their customers with fruit preserves. Made from boiled fruit, sugar, and sometimes a splash of brandy, preserves were stored in jars and served on bread, biscuits, or even corn dodgers. They weren't everyday fare. Sugar was expensive, fruit was seasonal, and jars broke on long wagon hauls. But when preserves did appear, they were treasured. A spoonful on a biscuit tasted like luxury, a reminder that even in the roughest towns, sweetness wasn't out of reach. For homesick settlers, preserves were more than food. They were comfort in a jar, and saloons that offered them, instant favorites. And now we come to our final stop, the drink that tied all saloon meals together, the unshakable king of the Wild West, whiskey. 25. Whiskey, the spirit of the saloon. Let's be honest, no matter what was cooking, the true centerpiece of every saloon was whiskey. Harsh, cheap, and often questionably distilled, whiskey was poured by the glass, the bottle, or sometimes straight from the barrel. It fueled poker games, sealed cattle deals, numbed saddle sores, and made even pickled pig's feet taste good. Early whiskey was often cut with tobacco juice, kerosene, or rattlesnake heads for flavor, and yet cowboys drank it like water, partly because actual water wasn't always safe. For the saloon, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was the business model. Food brought people in, but whiskey kept them paying. It was, in every sense, the spirit of the Wild West. So there you have it, 25 foods that filled bellies, fueled legends, and flavored the Wild West. From brain stew to biscuits, oysters to whiskey, saloons weren't just watering holes. They were kitchens of survival and community. If you love this ride through frontier flavor, hit that like button, subscribe for more history served hot, and share this with a friend who thinks cowboy food stopped at beans. Trust me, the Old West was a whole lot tastier.